Two boys entered the Tower of London. One was 12, the other was 9. One was supposed to become king. The other was his younger brother. They were princes. They were heirs. They were children. And then, sometime in the summer of 1483, they vanished from sight. No public funeral. No confirmed bodies. No confession that closed the case. Only silence. Their names were Edward V of England and Richard, Duke of York. History remembers them as the princes in the Tower. But this is not only a story about two missing boys. It is a story about a crown, a family at war with itself, a kingdom exhausted by blood, and a throne that could not tolerate uncertainty. For more than 500 years, one question has refused to die. What happened to the princes? Were they murdered? Were they hidden? Did one survive? Or were they erased because they stood between one man and the crown? This is the case of the princes in the Tower. To understand why two children became dangerous, we have to enter a kingdom already wounded by war. England in the late 1400s was not stable. It was a country shaped by rival families, broken alliances, and a crown that had been fought over again and again. This was the age of the Wars of the Roses, the House of Lancaster, the House of York, two branches of the same royal family, two claims to the same throne, and between them, years of betrayal, battle, imprisonment, and death. Edward IV, the boy's father, had fought his way to power as a Yorkist king. He was strong enough to win the throne and strong enough to keep it. But his reign carried one weakness that would become dangerous after his death: his marriage. Edward had married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow from a family many nobles considered too ambitious and too powerful. The Woodvilles gained influence. Old noble families grew resentful. And when Edward IV died suddenly in April 1483, the rivalries he had held down came back to life. Because the new king was not a warrior. He was a boy. Edward V was only 12 years old enough to inherit the crown, too young to defend it. When Edward IV died, his son was not in London. Edward V was at Ludlow, near the Welsh border, being raised for kingship. The plan seemed simple. The boy would travel to London. He would be crowned, and until he was old enough to rule alone, his uncle would guide the realm. That uncle was Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the dead king's brother, a respected soldier, a powerful nobleman, and now, the man expected to protect the young king. But protection and control can look almost identical. As Edward traveled toward London, Richard intercepted the royal party. Leading members of the Woodville faction were arrested. Edward continued to London, but not as a child moving freely toward his coronation. He was taken to the Tower. At first, this did not have to look sinister. The Tower of London was not only a prison, it was also a royal palace. Kings traditionally stayed there before coronation. Edward V was expected to leave the Tower not as a prisoner, but as a crowned king. But the coronation kept moving further away, and the Tower began to feel less like a palace, and more like a cage. While Edward was inside the Tower, his mother understood the danger. Elizabeth Woodville took refuge in Westminster Abbey, sanctuary, a sacred space where the law could not easily reach her. She brought her daughters, and she brought her younger son, Richard, Duke of York. The 9-year-old prince was now more than a child. He was the spare heir. If anything happened to Edward V, Richard could become the next figure of resistance. That made him valuable and dangerous. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, wanted the younger boy brought to the Tower too. The explanation sounded harmless enough. Edward should not be alone before his coronation. His brother should join him. Brother beside brother. Family beside family. But Elizabeth hesitated. She had already lost control of one son. Now she was being asked to surrender the other. Eventually, the younger Richard was taken from sanctuary. He joined his brother in the Tower. From that moment, both heirs were in one place. Both boys were under their uncle's control, and the path to the crown began to change direction. Edward V was supposed to be crowned. Preparations had begun. The city expected a new king. But then the story changed. A claim emerged that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had not been valid. The argument was that Edward had already made a marriage promise to another woman before marrying Elizabeth. If that was true, then Edward's children by Elizabeth were illegitimate. And if Edward V was illegitimate, he could not be king. The claim was later formalized in Titulus Regius, the act that justified Richard's title to the crown. But the political damage came earlier. The boy in the tower was no longer presented as the rightful king. He was presented as a child without a lawful claim. The throne moved away from Edward and toward his uncle. On June 26, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, accepted the crown. He became Richard III. On July 6th, he was crowned king. The coronation prepared for a 12-year-old boy became the coronation of the man who had been meant to protect him. Edward V had reigned in name, but he was never crowned. And now, inside the tower, two princes had become a problem. They were not kings, but they were still alive. This is where the record begins to darken. For a time, the boys were still seen inside the tower. There were reports of them playing, appearing at windows, existing still as visible children. But then the sightings became rarer. The princes were seen less and less visible, less reachable, less real. A contemporary observer, Dominic Mancini, later wrote that the boys were gradually withdrawn from view, and once they disappeared, the silence became louder than any accusation. No public explanation came. No official announcement described their fate. No funeral confirmed their deaths. No living prince emerged to challenge Richard III. The two boys who had stood at the center of England's future simply vanished. And that is what makes this case so interesting. History does not give us a body. It gives us absence. No final scene. No witness to the end. Only a locked fortress, a changed throne, and two children who stopped appearing. When people ask who had the strongest motive, one name rises immediately. Richard III. He was their uncle, their protector, and the man who gained the crown after they were declared illegitimate. As long as the princes lived, his throne was vulnerable. Even if they had been legally disinherited, they could still become symbols. A rebellion does not always need a perfect legal claim. Sometimes it only needs a face. And Edward V had been born to be king. For Richard's enemies, the boys were powerful weapons. If they lived, they could be rescued. If they lived, they could be used. If they lived, Richard's reign could be challenged again and again. So the accusation is simple. Richard had motive. Richard had access. Richard had the power to make the boys disappear. To many historians, that silence is devastating. But the case is not that easy. Motive is not proof, and history was not written in a courtroom. Richard's image was later shaped by the Tudor age, by men who had every reason to blacken the name of the king they had replaced. Shakespeare made Richard into one of history's most famous villains. But Shakespeare was writing drama, not evidence. So Richard remains the central suspect, but not a convicted man. Other names have also entered the shadows. After 1485, Henry Tudor had a reason to fear any surviving prince. A living Edward V or Richard, Duke of York, would have had a stronger blood claim than Henry VII himself. But Henry Tudor should not be treated as an equal suspect in the original disappearance. The boys seem to have vanished while Richard III held the tower and the throne. Henry's role belongs more to the aftermath. If the boys were dead, he benefited from silence. If one of the princes survived, Henry had every reason to make sure that truth never surfaced. That is what makes the case so difficult. The same disappearance could serve more than one ambition. And the records that remain are too thin to tell us who crossed the line from motive to action. Nearly 200 years later, the tower gave up something. In 1674, workmen were demolishing parts of the old palace buildings near the White Tower. Under a staircase, deep beneath the rubble, they found a wooden chest. Inside were the bones of two children. The bones were eventually placed in Westminster Abbey by order of Charles II. A monument identified them as Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. But identification is not proof. The science of the 1600s could not answer the question. In 1933, the bones were examined again. The remains were judged to belong to children, but the evidence was incomplete. Some bones had been lost. The original context of the discovery was uncertain. and modern DNA testing has not yet provided the final answer. So even the bones became part of the mystery. They may be the princes. They may not. They may be the closest thing we have to an ending, or another false door in a case full of them. Because if those bones belong to Edward and Richard, then the tower has been keeping the answer in plain sight for centuries. So what happened to the princes in the tower? There are three main ways to read the evidence. The first theory is the most famous. Richard III ordered the boys killed. This theory explains the motive. It explains the timing. It explains why the boys disappeared while he controlled the tower. But it depends on evidence that is incomplete, politically shaped, and partly written after Richard's enemies had won. The second theory is that someone else killed them. Perhaps Buckingham. Perhaps Tyrell. Perhaps another player acting with or without Richard's knowledge. This explains why the politics around the throne were so unstable. But it creates another problem. Could such a crime have happened inside the tower without Richard knowing? The third theory is that one or both princes survived. This is the most dramatic possibility. It explains why pretenders later appeared, including Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be the younger prince. It explains why uncertainty lasted so long. But it struggles against the silence. No confirmed prince returned. No undeniable proof of survival emerged. And no rival ever successfully exposed the truth. Each theory solves part of the puzzle. Each one fails somewhere. Richard had the clearest opportunity. Buckingham had ambition. Henry Tudor had later reason to fear a survivor. The Tower of London has held kings, queens, rebels, prisoners, and traitors. But few stories cling to its stones like this one. Two boys, one throne, a kingdom watching, and then nothing. No final witness, no proven killer, no answer that every historian accepts. The princes became more than missing children. They became a symbol of what power can do when bloodlines become obstacles. Because the most frightening part of the story is not only that two boys disappeared, it is that a kingdom moved on. A new king was crowned. Then another king replaced him. The Tudors rose. The Wars of the Roses ended. England changed. But the children remained inside the question. Edward V was never crowned. Richard, Duke of York, never grew into the role others feared he might claim. And maybe that is why this story still belongs in the blank pages of history. Not because no one wrote about the princes, but because after more than 5 centuries, the tower still keeps its final secret. So the question passes to us. Were the princes murdered by the uncle who took their throne? Were they victims of another player in the game of power? Or did one of them survive, only to be lost again inside the machinery of history? Two boys entered the tower, and the silence they left behind still echoes through England's history.